Welcome, Fadhel. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. So could we talk about prosperity, full employment, inflation, and the role of the state in this? And with state, it's come from Sweden. We mean the federal state in this case.
Absolutely. So we're talking about macroeconomic issues, right? So the role of the government in essentially achieving full employment, price stability, economic growth, and we can argue about how we define economic growth, what is included, but it's really what affects the average person is better described as prosperity. In other words, being able to have a decent quality of life, have access to education, health, public transportation, digital technology, having access to decent housing, having access to affordable resources that will allow us to thrive as a community. And when I say affordable, that brings in inflation. So how do we guarantee that we have a prosperous society that affords all of these resources and provides them at a level of prices and affordability that is commensurate with what we would call good quality of life and affordability? So that creates a debate in the macroeconomics profession for the last 100+ years in terms of what is the better mechanism to organize society to actually deliver those things. And then there's, broadly speaking, these two umbrella schools of thought, the Keynesian approach and the neoclassical approach, or in other words, an approach that says the free market is the best mechanism to organize society to deliver these things, and that any state intervention will actually make things worse, either in terms of inefficiency or cost or inflation and all of that. That's the neoclassical approach and neoliberal approach. Then you have the more Keynesian approach, post-Keynesian approach, and I would talk more about the MMT version of the recent developments in post-Keynesian economics, that says the state or the national government has a very important role in organizing society and guaranteeing that we can actually achieve full employment and price stability, and doing all of this in a free and a democratic society. So not like a dictatorial kind of communist system where the state dictates prices and the state dictates what you can consume and what you can't consume. It's mostly about organizing macroeconomic activity and having the state underwrite and guarantee certain things in the economy. So that's, broadly speaking, kind of the terms of the debate that we're engaged in and when it comes to public policy. And of course, it's a spectrum. You have everything in between, with some people saying, yes, in general, the free market is the best system, but in times of crisis, I guess we need a little bit of government intervention, but only a little bit, not too much. And as soon as we're out of the crisis, we should go back to deregulation and free markets and all of that. So that's kind of where we are. The MMT approach is essentially shining a bright light on how we pay for things and arguing that the myth that the national government or the federal government can't afford larger spending on health or education or infrastructure or transportation, that myth is exactly what we call it, a myth. Because in the mainstream approach, we're told that a larger government deficit will automatically lead to inflation. A larger government deficit will lead to higher interest rates, will bankrupt the country, and all of that. And what MMT has said from the beginning is that we have different kinds of governments with different degrees of fiscal spending capacity. So the spending capacity of the US, of Sweden, of Nigeria, of India, of China are not exactly the same. What determines the spending capacity is actually the risk of inflation. So MMT ties the possibilities of prosperity with the actual constraint, which is the risk of inflation. And for us, the risk of inflation comes from two major sources. One is the availability of real resources, productive capacity, that is skilled people, machinery, equipment, technology, raw materials that actually allow you to build more of certain assets. And the good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. When we build more of those strategic productive capacity investments, we create millions of jobs. and we actually increase the productive capacity, and as a result, reduce the risk of inflation, not increase it. This is a very important point. The second source of inflation, according to MMT, is abusive market power, where you have a handful of multinationals or domestic corporations who can raise prices simply because they can, or because we let them, because they have too much market power and they have very little competition. In many cases, this power is sanctioned and enforced by the state, by the federal government, by not regulating them. So that kind of inflation is not going to go away by spending less, by continuing on an austerity path. That type of inflation only goes away if we tax and regulate their market power out of existence, if we make that market more competitive. So, and if we're successful as a nation of doing both, doing the strategic investments in areas where we have shortages of productive capacity and taxing and regulating abusive market power, then what we're doing is essentially pushing that risk of inflation further and further away and ensuring that we can actually thrive and prosper as a society in strategic areas. So that's kind of the general framework in terms of how we do it. And when we spend, what should we be paying attention to? Productive capacity is the most important thing, and participatory market power, in other words, non-abusive monopoly power or oligopoly power, is very important to this approach. I'll give you one example so that we kind of dismiss this myth of the government deficit and debt causing hyperinflation and all that. Japan, for the last 30 plus years, has had one of the largest debt to GDP ratios in the world. Right now, it's 265% debt to GDP ratio. And Japan has been struggling not with inflation, not with high interest rates, not with bankrupt government, but Japan has negative interest rates. Japan has deflation, not inflation. And the Japanese government, because all of its national debt is denominated in Japanese yen, has no reason to default on its national debt. So the risk of default, despite what credit rating agencies say, the risk of default is zero, essentially, unless there's a political reason for the default, but no financial reason for default. So that's the good example that we can cite. And it's very important to distinguish that there are other countries with massive amounts of national debt, but their debt is denominated in foreign currencies. So most developing countries do actually have a risk of default because they borrow in foreign currencies that they can't issue, that they can't control domestically. So that's why we focus on the idea of spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Japan has a very high degree of monetary sovereignty, whereas a country that has a massive amount of external debt denominated in foreign currencies has a very limited fiscal spending capacity. And we can talk about how they can, reclaim a certain degree of monetary sovereignty, maybe in another discussion. So is that good as a starting point for our conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I think that was really good. So just trying to understand what you actually say in inflation is about two things. One is regulating market power that's abusive. And the other thing is having a government who's wise and understanding enough to invest in taking away bottlenecks and extending the productive capacity in the economy.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll give you an example. Let's say we wanted to invest in renewable energy capacity because it's important to deal with the climate crisis and all that. And we decide we're going to spend $5 billion in a particular country building wind and solar and geothermal infrastructure. We're going to hire 100,000 people, pay them very good wages and benefits to do the work. That's great. So now those individuals who are paid decent wages, we know what the average middle class family does with their income. They're going to buy transportation, housing, food, entertainment, clothing. We know what people buy, average middle class. So before we even start the program, before we even start the spending, we can anticipate what the level of additional demand for housing, for transportation, for food, for clothing, for entertainment, we can anticipate that. And if in our anticipation, we identify that there will be a substantial increase in demand for housing. And we recognize that the current housing stock and housing market situation is not going to be able to absorb that additional demand. We know already that our spending will cause inflation pressure point in the housing market. So we have two choices. We can either let it happen and then deal with the consequences, and then deal with the negative pushback that says, oh, we told you too much government spending is going to cause inflation. Or we can do the right thing from the beginning. And as we spend on renewable energy, we maybe can dedicate a portion of that budget. Instead of $5 billion on renewable energy, maybe we should do 4.5 billion on renewable energy and 500 million on building affordable housing to increase the productive capacity. Maybe the problem in the housing market is not just about availability of affordable housing. Maybe it's about abusive market power of landlords or real estate companies. And that abusive power is going to kick in no matter what. So what do? We tax and regulate that abusive market power so that it doesn't take advantage of the additional demand and drive up prices. So that's kind of the model, just to give you an example. And once you discover how to do this, once you discover where the national priorities are, where the secondary investments need to come in order to deal with the potential inflation pressure points, then the sky's the limit, because the limit is not 5 billion. You can be 10, it could be 15, it could be 17. It all depends on how much capacity you have to marshal the resources, productive resources, produce more of those resources, and manage the administration and implementation and assessment of all the investments that you're introducing. Whereas in the mainstream approach, we're constrained by tax revenues, by borrowing capacity from financial markets. And that keeps government finances very, very limited in terms of what they can do to introduce sustainable prosperity for society. And that's really the crux of the problem here, because we've been doing this for decades, and as a result, neglecting so many communities and so many important investments. And when the state neglects these investments, who's there to pick up the slack? It's either the private sector, if those opportunities are profitable, which means they're going to be exclusive services to people who can afford them, or it's going to be charity. And there's only so much that charity can do. Charity can never replace strategic investments, structural investments for at the macro level. So private sector is important. The charitable sector is important, but it cannot replace the national government, the state. There's also local states and municipalities who are even more constrained, because their only source of revenue and funding is primarily taxing their local residents. And that, again, adds the burden on households, on local businesses, especially small businesses. And that's been going on for decades now in the US and many other parts of the world. And now we're at a point where there's so much neglect that the cost of that neglect is unbearable for many communities. I'll give you an example of a series of studies that my colleagues and I are involved in. We call them the cost of doing nothing. And essentially what we're doing is arguing empirically that the cost of doing nothing, the cost of inaction from the federal government standpoint, is actually unaffordable, because the cost of doing the right thing is much, much cheaper than the cost of doing nothing. I'll give you an example. In the state of Ohio, where I live, in 2019 alone, we looked at the cost of the opioid crisis. In 1 year, 2019, the fatalities and non-fatalities cost is $41 billion. That's 1 year. And contrast that number, the $41 billion in one state in 1 year, with the $26 billion that the pharmaceutical companies are offering as settlement in court for the whole country for the decades of damage that they've caused. They're offering $26 billion, and the government is probably going to accept it. That's how bad the situation is. Why are the states accepting $26 billion in settlement? because they're so desperate for a couple of $1 billion each to spend on rehabilitation centers and programs that will help remediate the negative impact of the epidemic. But those few $1 million that each states will get will be spent in 3 or 4 years, and we'll be back to square one with massive cost to society. Same thing if you include the cost of mass incarceration, if you include the cost of environmental damage, lead in the water pipes, the impact of not decarbonizing the grid, all the particles that we breathe, all the water that we drink. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars every year that we're spending, and we're paying for it currently. This is not hypothetical. We're paying for it every year. And as I say, sometimes we pay for it with blood, tears, and money.
Yeah,
and we can be spending a fraction of that money in a transformative way. So what we're spending right now is Band-Aids, trying to deal with the pain. We want to spend in a transformative way. Now, who's going to do that transformative spending? If I put a GoFundMe page and say we're going to raise, $300 billion from charity, you can't do that at the national level. If you're going to say the private sector is going to do it, well, the private sector is not going to invest in these things because it doesn't pay off. If anything, the opposite pays off for the private sector. And then if we say it's going to be local municipalities or cities or states within the United States, they too have very limited budget constraint. And it means that they have to raise those tax revenues and tax their local residents and businesses. It doesn't work this way, not at that scale. The only entity that can actually step in and do these transformative investments, and these are once in a lifetime investments. This is not stuff that we have to build again and again. If you spend the right way from the beginning, you eliminate massive costs moving into the future. And that's the federal government. And that's where MMT becomes so important, to educate the public, educate lawmakers, elected officials, that the solutions are in their hands, that local communities are ready to do the hard work. They just need the funding, and the federal government has the capacity to do it. The same is true in Sweden and France and Australia and the UK. These are the kinds of policy conversations that we need to be pushing in the public discourse. And I think we're close. I feel like there's quite a bit of momentum to shift the narrative about what is right and what is wrong in terms of what we've been doing in public policy. And if you don't mind, I'll show you just one picture to illustrate kind of in a visual way what we're talking about here when we talk about quality of life, because
please do.
Yeah, it's important to kind of shift the narrative here. So when people talk about economic growth, there's a very important reason why they say GDP growth or economic growth is so important. So we need to prioritize investments that generate economic growth. Well, what are the kinds of investment that generate economic growth? Fracking, oil and gas extraction, all the things that we've been doing basic over the last 40 years. And yeah, it does produce economic growth. The problem is economic growth is the wrong measure for quality of life. And that's why many ecological economists have developed the alternative, which is GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, which essentially starts with the GDP numbers, but then removes all the negative effects of pollution, of inequality, and adds the good things that we should be adding to measure our quality of life, such as volunteer work, unpaid work in the household, which is mostly done by women in most parts of the world. So what we get then is that GPI for the United States has been flat for the last 30 or 40 years, even though economic growth has been increasing. So now when we focus on GPI as our metric for quality of life, then the question becomes, well, what are the kinds of investments that we should be spending on in order to increase GPI? And then all of a sudden, all the right kinds of investments will be listed. We're definitely not investing more in fossil fuel extraction. We need to be investing in decarbonizing the grid, decarbonizing public transportation, building clean water infrastructure, investing in children, in education. And this becomes common sense types of investments. And even with the most fiscally conservative finance ministers you find on the planet, if they have common sense, you ask them the following question: would you rather spend a little bit of money to inspire kids with music and theater and science and technology and summer camps and activities, which requires hiring staff and putting money on the table to actually make these programs nationwide programs, systematic programs to inspire the next generation with all kinds of things, or not do that because you think we don't have enough money to do it, and then for the next 15 years build more prisons for those same kids, deal with the cost of drug addiction for those same kids, deal with the cost of unemployment, deal with the lost productivity to society, the quality of life that we're losing, which is many, many times more expensive than the cost of the initial investment. Every person with a little bit of common sense will tell you, yes, the cost of doing the right thing is actually cheaper than the cost of doing nothing, which is really the narrative that we're trying to introduce. And now, who's going to do that initial investment instead of doing the Band-Aid solutions and all that? It's very hard for charity to do it on a systematic way. It's very hard for the private sector to do it in a profitable way. It's very hard for local schools or municipalities to do it. And that introduces inequality because the wealthier neighborhoods will have those resources, but not so wealthy neighborhoods will not have those resources. And that's why the national government, the federal government, has that moral and economic responsibility to do the right thing and to help us invest in the next generation, help us invest in decarbonizing the electric grid, help us invest in building clean water infrastructure, clean air infrastructure, and so on. And in a matter of 10 years or less, for most countries, the transformative impact will be visible, will be tangible, and will move all of these old myths about what is affordable, what is not affordable, into the historical archives for future generations to learn from our mistakes and to learn from the opportunities that we were able to create.
That sounds really great, Fadhel. Thanks a lot for taking up that. And I'm quite sure we need to walk that path if we want to have a future for everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I really believe this is within reach. This is not like impossibilities. We have the people, we have the resources, we have the technology, and the technology is getting even cheaper and more efficient by the day. What are we waiting for? The only thing stopping us is presumably cost and affordability and the deficit and inflation. And that's where MMT comes in and kind of sorts out what are the real risks associated with inflation and what are the mythical constraints and risks that have been blocking us for a long time now.
Okay, let's continue in next video then.
Thank you.
Thanks.